Hello again. This is the second part of my lecture on flexibility in dance, and we're just going to get started on talking about hypertonic muscle. Now, as we've been talking about muscle spindles before, what we're looking at is this increased normal resting tone in muscles. So muscles have a tone that they will be commonly set at, so that when you're relaxed or when you're sleeping in bed, your muscle tone is not, your muscle isn't completely switched off. There's always a little bit of tone in it. Now, increased normal resting muscle tone is recognized in neurological conditions like MS, stroke, Parkinson's disease, head injuries. But in dancers, hypertonic muscle is more likely to be overactive muscle caused by overuse or injury or poor mechanics, which we'll talk a little bit more as we go along. So how do you identify hypertonic overactive muscle? So the muscle looks contracted at rest. The muscle belly, when you palpate it, is tense. So if your bicep muscle was contracted like this, for example, then that would, and your arm was fairly relaxed, that wouldn't be a normal amount of tone in that muscle. And you get that in back muscles, thigh muscles, and probably as dancers during your career, you've come across that when you find that you've maybe had a muscle that you can't switch off, or you've tried to stretch it and it won't change. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be the case in a minute. The interesting thing about hypertonic overactive muscle is that stretching doesn't reduce the tone or make it longer. And in actual fact, it may often make it tighter. And I think if you talk to dancers, and certainly the dancers I see, they'll often say things like, my left hamstring is my tightest one, I've stretched it and I keep stretching it, doesn't matter how much I stretch it, it doesn't get any better. So what does this mean for stretching muscle? So if you've got a hypertonic muscle, so if you've got a muscle that its resting tone is elevated, the tendon, the belly of the muscle is contracted, then any force that you must apply to that muscle has to be applied slowly. Because as we saw before, if you apply force quickly, it will increase the spindle activity. An increased spindle activity in the muscle increases the muscle tone and prevents it from getting longer. Now, sometimes even slow application of force can increase tone. So why do we need to do this? Because a slow stretch reduces spindle activity and a fast stretch increases spindle activity. So you get a protective response, you get increased tone, and it stops the muscle lengthening. So you're kind of fighting against yourself. Now, the only time that a stretch might be useful from a spindle point of view to get the muscle to work better is if you want to prepare your muscle for a jump, or if you want to prepare your muscle for a ballistic type movement, but not if you want to lengthen tissue. So you kind of know this a little bit already, and you do it intuitively. How do you switch off hypertonic muscle? Dancers have been doing it for years. They either do really, really slow stretches, so they'll take it easy. They might warm the muscle up first, then apply the stretch incredibly slowly. They might use spiky balls. They might use a foam roller. They might use proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation techniques, which is PNF, such as contract, relax, whereas you would contract the muscle and then let it go, or you would hold the muscle and then let it go. So you'd hold it for longer, so you would just maybe contract, let go, contract like that, hold longer periods of time, let go. Now, that's because if you contract a muscle and get a maximum contraction is always followed by maximum relaxation. So although you were using the muscle spindle to almost trick itself into relaxing by increasing the tone, because then if you take the time, and that's the really important thing, if you take the time to relax the muscle afterwards, it will actually lengthen and the muscle tone will diminish. Now, I put at the bottom here, trigger point release. Dancers often have gone to physiotherapists in the past. They've often had trigger point therapy. It's a big bone of contention in the moment in the physiotherapy world, and not probably the place to discuss it. But I think a lot of it is about semantics. A lot of it is about the words that we're using, and a lot of it is about how we're talking about things rather than actually what's happening, because dancers will tell you they have tender points around their body, and if you apply force to those tender points, then you can actually reduce the discomfort in those areas and get more mobility in the muscle. Now, there's a bit of a shift towards calling them tension myalgia points, but as I said, it's big arguments, big contention in the physiotherapy world. But at the moment, there's a definite shift amongst physiotherapists to maybe disregard the concept of trigger point therapy and trigger point release. So from a physio point of view, what are the components of flexibility? So what am I looking at with my dancers if they come into the clinic? So I'm not just really looking at muscle. I'm looking at joint range of motion. I'm looking at muscle length. I'm looking at muscle tone that we just talked about. I'm also looking at mobility of neural structures. So I want to know, do the nerves glide and slide as readily and easily as the muscle, as the joint? I'm also interested in muscle balance. I'm interested in, do you have weakness in one area compared to another? Is one muscle group much stronger than another muscle group? I'm interested in how the muscles coordinate all together. So it's much more complicated than just, is the muscle short and do we need to make it longer? Because it's not all about the muscle. There's obviously a lot of stuff out there in the literature about non-contractile tissue, which we all call fascia. There's lots of fascial therapies. There's lots of physiotherapy focused on mobilizing fascia. Now, fascia is everywhere in our body. It wraps around individual contractile fibers. It wraps around bundles of contractile fibers. It wraps around non-contractile tissue. It wraps around our organs. It goes all the way from our big toe to the top of our head. It wraps around our brain. We have specialized non-contractile tissue in our brain called meninges that wrap around the spinal cord, that wrap around the nerves. So you can see there is a connection between the contractile tissue, the nerve fibers, the muscle fibers, everything is joined together. It gives a supportive function. There's some schools of thought that feel it has a communicative function, that it communicates via chemical changes around the body, that it definitely communicates mechanical change around the body. So what are the causes of decreased muscle length? It's not always just about shortened muscle. So you can have reduced length and non-contractile component of the muscle. So the fascial component that wraps around the fibrils or the fascial component that wraps around the muscle bellies themselves can be reduced. You can have increased tone in the contractile component that we talked about earlier with the muscle spindle. You can have reduced neural mobility. You can also have reduced joint range of motion, or more likely, you can have a combination of the above. So what is it about the mobility of neural tissue that we have to know or understand? We have to understand that nerves are contained within little bony fibrous tunnels. And in these tunnels, they slide along the tunnels during the movement. And it's the ability of this nerve to slide along the tunnel that will influence how dancers perceive their mobility and do they feel limited in movement. Now, if you, again, have a muscle that you have been stretching for a very, very long time, and you've also been doing PNF, you're doing hold relax, you've been using spiky balls, you've been foam rolling it and it's not getting any better, the chances are in a dancer with this, there's probably some component of reduced mobility of neural tissue. So muscle imbalance is another really, really important thing that we look at. We're looking for, and how can you determine that that's there? How do we know if that's there? And what we're looking for is movement dysfunction. So what I mean by that is there any altered characteristic movement patterns? So how someone initiates a movement, how they perform the movement through the range. Does it look coordinated? Does it look equal? Does it look balanced? Is there weakness at any part of the range? Did they have difficulty initiating the movement? Is there that increased tone again that we were talking about? Is there a problem with timing? So for example, when you lift your arm out to the side, your humerus goes into abduction first. After about 30 to 40 degrees of abduction, your scapula rotates around your ribs. Now, some people, when they start initiating movement, will go from their shoulder blade first. So humerus first, then shoulder blade, or shoulder blade, then humerus. So it's a really simple idea of how we're looking at timing, how movement starts going in one direction. And obviously, And if you're just looking at normal people who don't dance, who don't do the kind of extreme activities that dancers do, you can often get away with a little bit of mistiming. But with dancers, it's much more specific, because eventually a muscle imbalance and a timing problem will cause bony impaction, will cause muscle hypertonicity, and which will can eventually cause muscle shortening for different reasons. So how do we as physiotherapists assess flexibility in dancers? Well, we're interested in much, much more than, like I said, just the muscle length. We're interested in joint range. We are interested in muscle length, but we're also interested in neuromobility, and we're interested in muscle imbalance. And there's lots of different ways to do that, and there's lots of different specialized kind of protocols that you can follow. Obviously, joint range is really straightforward. We look at how much bend you can have, maybe in an elbow, say, or extension, flexion. We can use goniometers, which are plastic or metal measurement tools, to measure the degrees of angle that we have in each joint. When it comes to muscle length, again, you can use goniometers, but mostly physiotherapists would look at observation, and we'd lift both arms up, and if you have this here and one hand comes back to here and one hand's forward, you know that this right shoulder is a bit more limited than that. Now, obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of relative flexibility in a minute, because it's not just as simple as if that arm doesn't move, that's where the problem is, because the problem can be in other parts of the body. So neuromobility, we have specialized tests. We look at active tests, we look at passive tests, we look at tests that the dancer can do on their own, or we look at moving the joints through space to assess whether or not the nerves will move properly. Then we look at muscle imbalance, where we have, like, again, visual assessment. How do they have increased tone? Do they have decreased tone? Do they have decreased bulk? So has this been going on for a long time? And they also have underlying weakness. And that has caused a diminished bulk of the actual muscle that we're looking at. So glutes, hamstrings, quads, calves. We look at static alignment when they move. So again, is the movement coordinated, controlled? And then what are they like when they, dynamic movement, when they actually make the movement? How does that work? Now, there's an awful lot of discussion again about optimal postural alignment or perfect posture. I don't actually think there is such a thing. There's no such thing as perfect posture. Everyone's posture is dictated by their own anatomical basis. What the muscles, you've got the muscles, the bones, the joints, the ligaments, the fascia. The strength of muscles, the length of fascia. You have this, there is a kind of an ideal alignment in textbooks. It's quite old school, and I think we look more for an idea of optimal alignment for each individual, making it much more focused. So, but especially in ballet dancers, everything tends to be very kind of stylized, and we're often looking for a specific morphology, a specific shape, a specific aesthetic in the body. I think that's changing quite a bit. Certainly at Scottish Ballet, the type of dancers that we've had from a postural body morphology shape has changed quite a lot over the time that I've been there, from a height to a width to a general body size. So I think we're looking for optimal movement. We're looking for optimal performance of moving segments to really help dancers minimize joint wear. We want you to move as efficiently and as well as you can. So what happens if you get suboptimal postural alignment? Well, sometimes nothing, sometimes a lot. And what is suboptimal alignment? And do you need to change it? Do you need to correct it? And I suppose it really depends on how much range of motion you're limited in the joint, how much neuromobility you're missing, and what the muscle imbalance is like. And do you have a movement impairment syndrome, and which might lead to musculoskeletal pain? So there's a question of, if you're moving in a certain way and it's not causing you any harm, it might well be that that's completely fine for you. And it might, if it's the idea of not changing things too much, to make everything absolutely perfect, because there's a kind of there's parameters of movement where people, as long as you're working within those parameters and the load on your body isn't too much, and you're not too far away from optimal postural alignment, that you can, then you would leave well alone. You wouldn't do much about that. There's some of these not in the dance world, but certainly in everyday life, we see a lot of suboptimal postural alignment, and this pair are a good prime example. You can kind of see here flattened lumbar spine, increased thoracic kyphosis. This flattened lumbar spine goes with weak abdominals and a bulging belly. He can't stand up properly, and he needs to be able to see where he's going when he walks forward. So what happens is he extends his his cervical spine at this crease so he can keep his eyes level. Because if he followed that whole curve of where he was going, he would have to walk around facing the ground, which would mean he would end up bumping into things. I'm hoping this is his son here, who's well on the way to looking the same. He's got the head forward posture, not quite so much bulge, not so much thoracic flexion, and certainly not so much lumbar flexion. But it's a gradual kind of process. And you can see if he doesn't do much about this, he's going to end up with a significant suboptimal postural alignment, which for him might not mean very much because he might still be able to function and do everything he wants to do. In the dance world, suboptimal postural alignment looks a little bit different. And it's usually about, as an example of this is why relative flexibility is a big concept that's quite important in the dance world. If we look at this lassie here, she's got decent ankle dorsiflexion, good knee flexion, good hip extension, some lumbar extension to here, and then something funny happens at her thoracolumbar junction here. So she's got quite a stiff thoracic spine that won't extend. She's got good upper cervical, mid-cervical extension, and also ability to open up the front of her chest. But this joint here, this extension is not being shared equally up the back of her spine because she's got this hypermobile segment here, which wouldn't be a problem if she's able to do that and it doesn't give her any pain. She might well go through a career of doing this movement and never have any problems at all. However, if she has an area that is constantly taking all the load and the area isn't being dispersed around the rest of her spine, then that could end up being a bit of a problem for her. So we mentioned a little bit about relative flexibility with this concept that the body always follows the path of least resistance. So if you've got loose segments, they often get looser. If you've got stiff segments, you get stiffer. If you have a combination of that, which is relatively what happens, is you can get, if you try to stretch a stiff bit and that stiff bit has a loose bit on either side of it, usually what happens is the loose bits get looser and the stiff bit just stays the same. We'll all manage to get the movement in her hip to happen. This girl here, when she's taken up into extension, she's got to a certain point in hip. If you look at the angle here with her hip, she's got into maximum hip extension. Her dance teacher or the person that's asking her to do the movement wants her to move higher off the ground. So where she has to get the movement from, she has to get it from somewhere else. So you can just about see here in the crease of her leotard is that she's starting to get this movement in the lumbar spine. So once you've taken up all the movement in the hip, it goes to the next segment in your body where you will get the movement from. Now, if that's all working well and the balance between flexibility is fine, that won't be a problem. It's when the balance between different flexibilities is changed is when you get stuff like this happening. So you don't get, there's a discrepancy between the stiff bits and the loose bits, and you can end up with areas that become really hyperflexible. So how do you become and maintain flexibility? Well, you maintain good joint range of motion with movement, exercise, loading. You maintain good muscle length with stretching if required, or trigger point therapy, or spiky balls or foam rollers. And I told you I wouldn't use trigger point therapy, but it's a term that everyone understands. So it's for the purposes of today's lecture, I'll just say that and leave it there. Again, one of the most important things is really maintaining appropriate muscle strength. So dancers often need to be doing supplementary strength training alongside their practice to make sure that their muscle strength is up to scratch. And I think I've come to believe over the last 20 years of doing this is that that's one of the most important things that, and certainly at Scottish Ballet, we have pushed the muscle strengthening component to the point that we have a new gym with Olympic weights, and Martin, the physiotherapist there, does a significant amount of strength training with dancers, specific strength training for specific types, for specific rep, and then general strength training to make sure they're generally strong. We look at maintaining good neuromobility, so teaching dancers how to mobilize nerves, how to look at making sure that nerve mobility is as important as muscle length. And all of that comes together to maintain optimal movement. So again, we're coming after we'll do all of these individual things, range of motion, muscle strength, muscle length, neuromobility. We want to know how they actually move, because that's what it's all about. And hopefully these are some of the Scottish ballet dancers who we hope, you can see this guy here. This is Chris, and he's got really good muscle definition. He's got poise, he's got balance, he's got the aesthetic that we're looking for, but he looks comfortable in his movement. He doesn't look, it's not too much effort for him. And that is us, guys. So I'm hoping that gives a little bit of insight into the kind of more widespread things we're thinking about when we're looking at flexibility, that it's not just about muscle length, that in actual fact, it's about neuromobility, it's about muscle strength, it's about coordination. And if we look at all of those things, then hopefully in the future, we'll keep our dancers fitter and away from injury. And yeah, and hopefully, I think that the way things are going in the dance world, there's a definite big shift towards strengthening and maybe movement awareness. And I think those two things hopefully are going to be the thing that stops dancers getting so many injuries and keeps them dancing for longer. Anyway, listen, thank you very much for listening. And I think we're going to move now to a little bit of a question and answer session. So I'll look forward to that, and I'll speak to you in a minute. Take care.